I know what you're thinking. Who is this person, and why do they have such great taste in jumpers? My name's Liberty, I make booktube content and go to Cambridge. I also have good taste in jumpers. Many facets to my personality. In today's video, I'll be discussing my best books of 2021. So, I have 8 books to talk about today, across a variety of genres, classics, YA, some book talk thrown in there. These are my best books of 2021, and I've only been able to work this out by looking on my story graph and seeing which ones I've rated 5 stars. So, this is 5 stars as my original reaction to the book. Might not be objectively great, probably won't stand the test of time. The first book on this list is probably known to you. If you've been around on booktube, especially if you've been around on book talk, you will have heard of this book. It has a lot of hype, and I think for good reason, mostly because I am a queer person who desperately craves more queer content in the world, and it was beautiful. It was gorgeous. Freaky in places, I'll be honest, but you know what I'm talking about. It's Song of Achilles by Madeleine Miller. This book has been doing the rounds because it is just this beautiful, lyrical, haunting love story between Achilles and Patroclus. It's a retelling of the Iliad by Homer. The Iliad is quite old, but there have been discussions of its homoeroticism / straight up gay love story for the millennia that it's been around. Do you know what? I actually have a copy of the Iliad. Somewhere. Do I?
Yes. Well, sort of.
It was right back at the beginning of the year that I read this, so honestly, I don't remember everything in detail. What I do remember is the enchanting way that Madeleine Miller writes. It truly feels like the lyricism of a 19th century novel in the shape of both a beautiful romance and also a very accessible YA novel. It's a retelling of Greek myth, which is already tricky to do without becoming elitist and a little bit hard to follow. But she introduces all the characters of Greek myth very fluently, very easily, and it's just a really beautiful thing to follow along with. I have seen some interesting reviews that critique the way she handles the women in the war. She writes as if Patroclus and even Achilles become friends with these women, but they are completely enslaved in this situation. They are trafficked. The idea that those women ended up having, if not a perfect, then at least a reasonably happy life in the camp with Patroclus is debatable, both historically and according to the original text of the Iliad. There are other retellings that deal with this subject matter a little bit more sensitively, perhaps, but by dealing with it more accurately, it's of course quite harrowing. So if you would like to, I would recommend The Silence of the Girls by... This is awkward, I've forgotten the name of the author. Hang on. Pat Barker. I would recommend The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I haven't read it myself, being transparent, but I've heard some very interesting things from those who study classics and are more in tune with the reality of the situation. But apart from that kind of angle of critique, personally, I just thought that the way the feelings of Patroclus for Achilles and the understanding of Achilles' returned feelings was written was just truly beautiful in a way that I don't think I have read many times before. I felt completely buoyed up by their love, which is hard to come by. Next up, we have a book that I do not have physically because I listened to it on audio, which was North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This was a brilliant novel set in the 1850s, written in the 1860s, I believe. And essentially, it's the story of a woman named Margaret who has been raised in pretty wealthy conditions in the rural South, lower middle class perhaps, but also educated alongside her cousin in extremely high society London. But then, upon his father distancing himself from the church, they have to give up their house in the rural South and they end up moving to the industrial North, to Milton Mowbray, although this is essentially, as far as I understand it, Manchester. It is the story of North and South, the clash between these two divided areas of the UK, not literally in one latitude line north to south, but the difference in ideology and social makeup and perspective and politics between people in rural situations who haven't felt the test of modernity yet, and those who are racing ahead with the cutting edge of technology in the Industrial Revolution. It's a class divide, it's a geography divide, it's a ideology divide, it's a beautiful, beautiful method with which to tell the story of people and their struggles, because essentially the characters of this story are cogs in the machine, and it's haunting and it's beautiful. And Margaret is also an amazing character. There is a lot of snobbery involved when she first arrives. There's a central scene, I won't spoil it too much, where something of a protest happens, which involves Margaret being stuck with someone that she has previously hated. It's somewhat of an enemies to lovers romance as well. I should be clear here. Because the man that she desperately hates symbolises this industrial north, symbolises the town that she has been forced to and that she despises. That scene with protest and words as such powerful forces is one of the most genuinely riveting in a classic that I've ever read. I love this book. I really recommend. Right, the third book in this list is Ocean Vongs on Earth Were Briefly Gorgeous. And it is gorgeous. The title says it all. This is a story about an Asian American man who immigrated into the US at a very young age and is learning, growing and living among a family deeply entrenched in the context from which they came, in Vietnamese culture, in Vietnamese language, more importantly in the Vietnamese War, which so completely tore them apart. It considers the life of being an immigrant, the issue of race, of gender, of sexuality, when the central character discovers feelings as a teenager for another boy at the farm he works at. And it's told in these little vignettes, which are all mixed up in order, which is a classic device of the more literary novel. It's beautiful. It's hard to piece together. It's structured like memory, where each little fragment forms a whole, which is a feeling more than distinct memories, distinct chains of events. And I read it in 2 sittings, and it was completely worthwhile. It's definitely more character than plot, so for some this wouldn't be their cup of tea, but I also think it is so worthwhile if you do want to give it a go. Next up, we have Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This book was first published in 1959, and it really embodies that era of politics, but also, most importantly, psychology. It's deeply centred around the concepts of intelligence that were central to experimental psychology at the time. I studied psychology at A-level. It was my favourite subject by far because it was so interesting trying to understand people and social relations and what makes the world go round in terms of humankind. And it's only in my 1.5 years since starting university that I've begun to see the flaws of psychology as a discipline. There has definitely been improvement in the last few decades. I am not pretending that psychology is all the way it was back in the 50s, but the standard that was set in early psychology is one of experimentation, which can be both damaging to the participants, but also damaging to society in some ways. When parts of this psychology get unleashed into the world, into pop culture, and a kind of pseudo-scientific concept is born, many of which are so deeply entrenched in our society that it becomes difficult to understand that they're so little fact that actually using these metrics as fact is inherently damaging. And the one that is most core to that is intelligence. By the time I was studying intelligence in 2019, there was definitely more understanding of the variety of intelligence. The type that is measured in metrics, the type that you see on IQ tests, is one specific subset, an academic subset, which I've been very good at traditionally. And it's not until that lesson that I truly began to appreciate the way that intelligence really doesn't have to mean that at all. Intelligence is aptitude, and aptitude can be at literally anything. This may seem like a tangent, but I'm getting there. I was definitely at fault of seeing myself as, in some respects, superior in intelligence to those who were good at other things. I could very much blame the education system as it is, but fundamentally there is an idea that what's valuable is cleverness, but cleverness in the academic way. Cleverness that means that you are really good at tests, that you're really good at maths, or you're really good at science, or you're really good at writing. It's clever, but in a very specific way. And that's privileged above others, like bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the kind where you're really good at hand-eye coordination. I have never been good at that, so I truly am subpar at that level of intelligence. Musical intelligence, I have none of that either. I did do piano for 1 year when I was little, and I'm pleased to say that I quit soon. Whereas one of my closest friends in uni with me is an absolutely astounding musician. She is a pianist, and to me it all sounds like random notes, but I know to others who understand music, who have that musical intelligence, she is incredible. Similarly, I think it's a shame that as a society we don't value interpersonal intelligence and emotional intelligence as much as we should do. And so finally, to kind of get back round to my point, this book was so powerful to me because I came from this place of knowing IQ tests as they are to be such a limiting factor, so dangerous to judge yourself by. And so seeing the horrible science that gets done in this book to a man who has a learning disability, that means that he is low IQ. It's never specified what kind of disability he has, but obviously the terminology of the 50s is different to today anyway. He is happy working in his bakery. He is happy in his life. And the book suggests that's because he doesn't know any better. The devastating part was where he started to truly believe that intelligence in the academic sense, in the IQ test sense, was valuable, was what was important. And so he began to lose his sense of self. You could argue that he only gained a sense of self with the experiments that happen in this book. But to me, it was devastating when he lost this new version of himself, because he truly began to believe the narratives being told around him, which were that his previous self, his self that had learning disabilities and was not academically intelligent in any way, was somehow inferior. I don't know, this is a bit of a ramble, this is a bit of an incoherent ramble, but I hope you understand what I mean. It's a book about worth and value. I genuinely wept at the end of this book, which doesn't happen with me very often. However, one pretty important caveat though, I did read this many months ago and have since learned a lot more about disability and chronic illness in general and the issues that that community faces. The community I'm now part of, by the way. And I do think that there are valid criticisms to be made of this book for the way that it does narratively agree with this experimental psychology concept of IQ and intelligence being saving graces, being something that make you more. And that's a very damaging rhetoric to have around people with disabilities. So I think if I read it again, I might have a different perspective. But I think there's something very beautiful about the way that Charlie's diary entries, because this is how the story is told, change throughout the novel as his sense of self changes. I think that there is something so beautifully artistic about that. So I can't say for sure whether it stands up to a 5 stars, but I can say that it was beautiful. Right, another classic now. We've got The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. The lesser known Brontë sister. I'm sure you've heard of Jane Eyre. I'm sure you've heard of Wuthering Heights. But The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is the most famous novel by this third Brontë sister, and in my opinion, far surpasses those other two novels. Different themes, obviously, and different literary styles. I mean, the atmosphere created by Wuthering Heights is incredible. The dark storyline of Jane Eyre is unforgettable. But I also think that The Tenant of Wildfell Hall has the most interesting thematic discussions. It's not just about people going crazy or having disaster or death or poverty. It's about the central woman. Can't even remember her name, hang on. She's called Helen. It's about the central woman, Helen, being the captain of her fate. It's about abuse and trauma, but it's also about someone harnessing their mind and their creativity and their self-belief and belief in the world even to get away from that situation. It's also told like it's an epistolary narrative again, but it's told like a story within a story in much the same way in a very similar way to Wuthering Heights actually. There's quite an interesting parallel to be made there, where the actual narrator is someone else called Mr. Lawrence, who has arrived in a new area to then meet Helen upon the moor. And she then eventually gives him her diary from when she was in this abusive relationship previously, which details her behaviour, which details her experiences and her flight and the meaning of why she is where she is and what she's doing. In that way, it's also about perspective and what an outsider will think of a situation against what that person experiences themselves. I think it's beautiful, and I think it's also by far more feminist and more interesting in those kind of narratives of inequality and power that this novel really discusses in detail. It is far better in that sense than Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, which are top tier toxic relationships. And yeah, I would highly recommend. Right, we're losing the light. Okay, right. The next one, again, I don't have because I had to give it back to my university library. It is The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged by Sam Friedman and Daniel Laurison. I'm sorry, I'm reading off my laptop screen. What are you going to do about it? This is a non-fiction, which is not something I usually read, to be fair, because of the amount of non-fiction I have to read already for uni. And it is a sociological text all about the myth of meritocracy in the UK. Meritocracy is the idea that people's socioeconomic status is derived from their merit, which is to say that people get jobs because they're good at it, or they get certain privileges because they deserve it. But obviously this is completely unfounded in sociological reality, and it was really interesting seeing this detailed discussion of social mobility. Particularly the way people move between different classes is completely defined by other factors than just merit, and specifically I found it very interesting in the way it tied into my studies with the discussion of Pierre Bourdieu's idea of economic, social and cultural capital. Sorry, boring technical stuff. But it was essentially a 5-star read because it was just eye-opening to me, and it really, really undermined any lingering ideas I had of meritocracy. A bit of a critique I did have was that it was not wholly intersectional. There were some attempts made, so one of the authors is a cis man and one is a trans man, and they definitely attempted to come at it with an intersectional lens, probably because of that. But there is, for example, very little discussion of disability in the workplace and how notions of value are ascribed to different people, essentially. So I think more could have been done in that sense, but for what it was, which was a baseline discussion of meritocracy and power dynamics and basic sociological issues, I thought it was very interesting, especially in the way it used case studies conducted via interview with people in the workplace to drive home its points. I thought that was very interesting. Okay, nearly there. We have Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery, which was truly the most gorgeous thing I've ever read in my life. Genuinely, my favourite book. My favourite read of this year, possibly ever, because it truly encapsulated that beautiful, wholesome found family dynamic that just completely pierces my soul. There's very little that can be better than just food writing and nature writing and the way that creative imagination and childhood play and just notions of life and death were so carefully interwoven in this story to really create this beautiful community and atmosphere which just feels so welcoming. I definitely think it is a product of its time. It is obviously flawed by the way that it was written at the turn of the century, the 20th century, so published first in 1908. It has what I think are really interesting discussions of gender for the time, but it also definitely has some underlying racist ideology, including some praise of missionaries and things like that, which I definitely think took away slightly from it for me. But otherwise, the feeling, the wholesomeness was unparalleled. Oh, it's also set in Canada, by the way. The what's it called? Prince Edward Island. Can't remember. But essentially rural Canada, which makes me want to go to Canada, honestly. Anne of Green Gables. I mean, you can just tell by the cover that it's wholesome. Like, I really recommend if you just want a break. It is gorgeous. It is a children's book, but it has the language of classics, so it is a somewhat halfway house. And I'm so excited to keep reading the series. I've read the second one since, which wasn't as good, but I've heard excellent things about the third, so watch out for me reading more of those. And finally, another that I don't have physically because I read it on my Kindle was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Now this one, I won't pretend that I believe it's a 5 stars anymore. It's been a while since I read it. It was February when I read it, so it's been enough months that I have changed. There's been some deep personal changes this year. The most powerful review I've heard that really kind of drove home the issues with the story that I kind of half noticed at the time but didn't fully reflect on was definitely by Cindy. I will leave her channel in the description so you can go and watch the video, because it's all about the almost complete absence of people of colour in the novel, which makes no sense if you consider the fact that the central character has been alive for several centuries and has lived in not just France but the US for much of that. As Cindy discusses, there is a lot of competing factors as to why this may be a good idea that the author didn't write any people of colour in to this history, but it also reads as someone who hasn't read their history, if you know what I mean. Also, frankly, just another little critique in a much less serious note is that she just didn't go anywhere. She went to Milan, I think, or Florence, and she was in France, and then she went to the US. It might have taken her a while to travel the globe back in the 1700s, but she had time. Do you know what I mean? She had time. She could have gone anywhere. She could have gone to I don't know, China, but instead she stayed in France. The thing that really stuck with me was the notion of leaving a legacy in a much less tangible way than I'd ever thought of it before. It was leaving a legacy in terms of inspiring art and music and an imprint on the world that's negative space instead of an active contribution by oneself. Do you know what I mean? That kind of thematic point was very beautiful and definitely at the time kind of comforted me, because I was having somewhat of a crisis about myself, my future, what am I doing on this world, you know? It was mid-third lockdown in the UK, we were all struggling. So there was definitely value at the time, which is of course why I rated it 5 stars, but I definitely think this one would read differently upon rereading. Right, now the sun has pretty much gone down now because it is December in the UK and apparently we're not allowed sun. But you know, I've got some cool ambience, I've got some cool golden effects on my skin. No. So yeah, that's everything. That's my 8 favourite books of the year. And I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you think and tell me if you have any comments on the books that I've discussed or if you have any recommendations. Have a good rest of your day, and I really hope to see you soon. Bye bye.